And that's how
Good.
Awesome.
What?
Have you checked Thomas's Facebook? He killed a possum today. He's very proud.
Anyway, good Monday evening at 7:00 p.m. Confederate Standard Time. Hope everybody is having a great start to their week. Before we get started, as usual, the views and opinions expressed on this program are not necessarily those of the SCV, its GEC, any division, brigades, camps, or other subsidiaries. Strictly those of us that are expressing them. Good evening and Faversham to everyone, especially to Chuck McMichael, who is celebrating National Senior Citizens Day. Not saying that he's a senior citizen, but he's wishing everyone a National Senior Citizens Day.
All righty then.
Indeed, it's the third Monday of the month, and that means that we have Carl Jones, AOT Councilman Extraordinaire and illustrious potentate of the Spatula Cavalry, on with us tonight. We mentioned, excuse me, I did not mean to put that back up.
Back and forth, Chuck.
Forgot where I was going with that. Anyway, if you saw some of our promotional stuff for this week's episode and you paid attention to last week's, we talked about the charge and what it means to us. And some of the things that we're supposed to do in the charge is to vindicate the cause for which our Confederate ancestors fought for and defend the Confederate soldiers' good name. We also mentioned that there's a lot of videos out there on the YouTubes, which SCV chat is on. You can find our videos there, as well as on our Facebook page and on our website, that are made by, how do I put this nicely? Idiots. And they trying to steal Carl's thunder. They lie. They lie about our ancestors, lie about the things that our ancestors fought for and stood for. And part of our thing here at SCV Chat is reclaiming the narrative. So a couple of times, and maybe more than that, given the number of videos that are out there, we're going to be correcting the myths and lies that are and slanders that are out there. So we're starting that this evening. Before we get started, good afternoon, Carl. How are you?
I'm good, buddy. How are y'all?
Can't complain.
Hungry, but what else is new?
I ate before the show tonight. First time for everything.
Smart.
I wish I had those sandwiches that bear took from us. But you ready to get into it, or we don't have a trivia question tonight because we're trying to get this hot and heavy and semi-seriously. So Moose, why don't you go ahead and do the little bit of housekeeping that you need to do before we get started?
All right. So I will be mostly behind the scenes tonight, making sure that we abide by the Copyright Act of 1976. You will see it at the bottom of your screen. And, of course, scrolling on our screen to make sure that we are following the fair use policy. We are reacting to someone's video tonight. We are reacting to PragerU's video, was the Civil War about slavery. You can follow and look at their original content and the link in the description. We do have to say you should go support them, but we will let tonight help you make that decision. So without further ado, let me put this up for a quick couple seconds and we will get started.
Well, maybe not support, but go watch.
Yeah, that's a much better way to say that.
Yeah. Copyright 19 allowance of fair use for purposes such as criticism, okay. Comment, okay. News reporting, okay. Teaching, okay. Scholarship and research. So we hit a lot of those check marks. Fair use is permitted by copyright statute that might otherwise be infringing. Nonprofit, educational, or personal use tips the balance in the favor for fair use. No copyright infringement intended. All rights belong to their respective owners. Moose disappeared for some reason.
I'm going to stay behind the scenes to work everything tonight, so I'm going to let y'all take this one.
Okay, Carl, you ready to jump into it?
I'm ready.
All right. So what we're gonna do is we've got the screen, the video right there. Um, it's black right now. We'll start playing it here in a minute. Carl, whenever you're ready to make a point, just yell pause, and Moose will pause it.
All right.
All right.
Was the American Civil War fought because of slavery? More than 150 years later, this remains a controversial question. Why? Because many people don't want to believe that the citizens of the southern states were willing to fight and die to preserve a morally repugnant institution. There has to be another reason, we are told. Well, there isn't. The evidence is clear and overwhelming.
Okay,
Slavery
stop.
was by a
Well, there isn't. I mean, what just freaking wonderful scholarship there is there. And do you like the snarky Ichabod Crane tone in his voice? I'm telling you, this is the guy that they ran out of New York in The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. This is Ichabod Crane. Okay. Who, by the way, was designed to be the stereotypical snooty know-it-all Yankee coming down from Connecticut. But go back to what he says. According to him, there is no scholarship in this. I mean, right out of the starting gate, this guy's hitting the heights of stupidity, and ignorance and dishonesty, all wrapped together in one. He says, basically he's implying there is no scholarship that substantiates that the war could have been about anything else. Okay, that this is based on raw emotion. All right, so I'm going to leave it at that for now. But that's
right.
A chaotic and dishonest statement.
Right, and what they bring up here, and he's saying that none of these are, that it's just slavery. Leaving out states' rights and a whole lot of other stuff that he'll mention in the video, and we'll rebut. But I mean, any type of pure, that's the only reason why a war is fought, needs to be looked at with any type of caution. But yeah. Anyway, Moose, continue.
Wide margin, the single most important cause of the Civil War for both sides. Before the presidential election of 1860, a South Carolina newspaper warned that the issue before the country was the extinction of slavery and called on all who were not prepared to surrender the institution to act. Shortly after Abraham Lincoln's victory, they did. The secession documents of every Southern state made clear, crystal clear, that they were leaving the Union in order to protect their peculiar institution of slavery.
All right, Moose, Paul.
At the time,
I was going to let it just go all the way through. I've got all of these talking points written down and just come back to them because there's some of them I'm going to hit 2 or 3 of them at one time, but just
right.
whatever.
Well, I just want to point out that on the map, and it's something that I missed earlier. He does have some of the border states in there. I believe he has all the border states, particularly Missouri, which I'm sure Carl will bring up at some point. But just wanted to point that out on the map. But continue on, Moose.
Meant the thing special to them. The vote to secede was 169-0 in South Carolina, 166-7 in Texas, 84-15 in Mississippi. In no Southern state was the vote close. Alexander Stephens of Georgia, the Confederacy's vice president, clearly articulated the views of the South in March 1861. Our new government, he said, was founded on slavery. Its foundations are laid. Its cornerstone rests upon the great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery, submission to the superior race, is his natural and normal condition. Yet despite the evidence, many continue to argue that other factors superseded slavery as the cause of the Civil War. Some argue that the South only wanted to protect states' rights. But this raises an obvious question. The states' rights to what? Wasn't it to maintain and spread slavery? Moreover, states' rights was not an exclusive Southern issue. All the states, North and South, sought to protect their rights. Sometimes they petitioned the federal government. Sometimes they quarreled with each other. In fact, Mississippians complained that New York had too strong a concept of states' rights because it would not allow Delta.
All right, I did not write this one down. I thought of it later. So I didn't actually put this one on my list, I don't believe. But here's my response to the fact that Mississippi argued that New York has too strong a concept of states' rights. Well, first of all, so what? Did Mississippi try to use the federal government to overthrow New York states' rights? No. The Constitution was founded, the Union was formed on the idea of states' rights. In a little while, I'm going to get to why that was so and why it could not work any other way. The fact that Mississippi wanted to be able to take slaves into non-slave holding New York, that's irrelevant unless Mississippi tried to use the power and force of the central government to overthrow what the Constitution established. So that's just that is one among many examples of Sedgley in here obfuscating the point and trying to say, oh, see, they did it too, when nothing could be further from the truth. Go ahead, Moose.
The planners to bring their slaves to Manhattan. The South was preoccupied with states' rights because it was preoccupied first and foremost with retaining slavery. Some argue that the cause of the war was economic. The North was industrial and the South agrarian. And so the two lived in such economically different societies that they could no longer stay together. Not true. In the middle of the 19th century, both North and South were agrarian societies. In fact, the North produced far more food crops than did the South. But Northern farmers had to pay their farmhands, who were free to come and go as they pleased, while Southern plantation owners exploited slaves over whom they had total control. And it wasn't just plantation owners who supported slavery. The slave society was embraced by all classes in the South. The rich had multiple motivations for wanting to maintain slavery, but so did the poor, non-slaveholding whites. The peculiar institution ensured that they did not fall to the bottom rung of the social ladder. That's why another argument that the Civil War couldn't have been about slavery because so few people owned slaves has little merit. Finally, many have argued that President Abraham Lincoln fought the war to keep the Union together, not to end slavery. That was true at the outset of the war, but he did so with the clear knowledge that keeping the Union together meant either spreading slavery to all the states, an unacceptable solution, or vanquishing it altogether. In a famous campaign speech in 1858, Lincoln said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." What was it that divided the country? It was slavery and only slavery. He continued, "I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. It will become all one thing or all the other." Lincoln's view never changed, and as the war progressed, the moral component, ending slavery, became more and more fixed in his mind. His Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 turned that into law. Slavery is the great shame of America's history. No one denies that. But it's to America's everlasting credit that it fought the most devastating war in its history in order to abolish slavery. As a soldier, I am proud that the United States Army, my army, defeated the Confederates. In its finest hour, soldiers wearing this blue uniform, almost 200,000 of them former slaves themselves, destroyed chattel slavery, freed 4 million men, women, and children from human bondage, and saved the United States of America. I'm Colonel Ty Sedgley, professor and head, Department of History at the United States Military Academy, West Point, for Prager University.
Join.
Yeah, don't.
You know, the first thing right out of the starting gate, we should be embarrassed that this guy is representative of mainstream academia today. There are very few in history departments and universities across the country that are any more smarter or any more intelligent or honest than he is. Okay, but let's go back. The evidence is clear and overwhelming that the war was caused by slavery. And as proof, what does he cite? A Charleston newspaper. A newspaper.
One single source.
Yeah, when did the media become a source of original intent for anything? I mean, good grief. I've seen reporters that couldn't spell their own name properly. And he says he maintains it was the cause for both sides. Okay, where is this evidence that the war was caused by slavery? I think he conflates the act of separation, the act of secession on behalf of the certain southern states as itself being an act of war. It is not. Secession is a means of trying to avert war. There had been one, and I'll talk about Stevens's speech, so-called, in a little while. But notice even what Stevens said, that slavery is the immediate cause, or what he was reported to have said. Let me put it that way: the immediate cause. When he, in the vernacular of the 19th century, that would mean that there were other causes. In other words, substitute the word immediate for latest, and you have the intent that Stevens is voicing there. It's the latest cause. There were numerous other things. There were tariffs. There were new states coming into the Union. I mean, they argued with the acceptance of Missouri into the Union as to whether it should be forced to come in as a free state, or whether they should have the right to vote for themselves, whether they came in for slave or free. That wasn't a slavery issue. That was an issue centered around, well, what the North is trying to tell us is that new states coming into the Union will not come in on fair and equal footing with us or the original 13. If you tell them they must do this, they must do that, you're denying them that. So there were numerous causes going back to the day that the ink dried on the Constitution and the Constitution was ratified and the Union formed. They were having issues north and south from that day forward, and it eventually came to the point where the South said, "Hey, we're either going to have to fight a war to exert control over this government and bring it back to its constitutional intent, or we're going to have to leave." And they chose the peaceful means, which was to separate. So secession is not an act of war. Sedgley is too caught up in his own worldview, preconceived worldview, I should say, to understand that or to admit it. He says it was clear that they were serving the Union to protect the peculiar institution of slavery. Well, and he goes in there and he says that Lincoln, he's adhering to this old myth. It's unproven. All the evidence is points to the contrary on this. But this he's implying that Lincoln's views evolved over time. That yes, initially in the war it was to save the Union, but his opinions evolved and it became about slavery. There's no proof of that. There's no evidence of that. All of the evidence is contrary to that fact. The North did not invade over slavery. They made this abundantly clear. It was clear in Lincoln's first inaugural address. It was clear from the Corwin Amendment. It was clear from the give me the name of it, the act that was passed in June of 1861, Crittenden-Johnson Act, that was passed. The U.S. Congress said we pursue war to preserve the Union, not to end slavery. So the North would be surprised that both sides went to war over slavery.
Yeah, and you, going back to what you're talking about with the with Lincoln's supposed ideas of him progressing as the war went on. The Emancipation Proclamation was written in September of 1862. When he mentions that in there, and he does the same thing that every modern U.S. history teacher in the public school does. He dumbs it down to, the Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves. No, it didn't, because the South was its own independent nation. If not, why'd we have to reapply to come back in as states during Reconstruction? But the only thing that it did was free the slaves in the southern states that he had no control over. Meanwhile, Washington, D.C. and other states within the Union, and even then it was in areas of rebellion. Parts of Louisiana and Tennessee, where the federal armies had already conquered, the Emancipation Proclamation did not affect them.
Well, let's back up from there. In his opening statement, he says, every ordinance of secession made clear that they were leaving the Union to protect the peculiar institution of slavery. That's a bald-faced lie. Most of them do not say that at all. To my recollection, of 13 states that issued ordinances of secession, 5 of them mentioned slavery. Okay. You mentioned Missouri earlier. Let me read to you real quickly what Missouri said in her ordinance of secession. Whereas the government of the United States in the possession and under the control of a sectional party has wantonly violated the compact originally made between said government and the state of Missouri by invading with hostile armies the soil of the state, attacking and making prisoners the militia while legally assembled under the state laws, forcibly occupying the state capital, and attempting through the instrumentality of domestic traitors to usurp the state government, seizing and destroying private property, and murdering with fiendish malignity peaceable citizens, men, women, and children, together with other acts of atrocity indicating a deep-settled hostility towards the people of Missouri and their institutions. And whereas the present administration of the government of the United States has utterly ignored the Constitution, subverted the government as constructed and intended by its makers, and established a despotic and arbitrary power instead thereof, now therefore being enacted that we secede. I'm going to, cut the chase on that. No, Missouri did not mention slavery. For the record, if you go read most of the state ordinances of secession, the underlying theme is not slavery at all. It is the government neglecting to abide by the Constitution as written and ratified. Even slavery was wrapped up in that issue. South Carolina's first ordinance of secession, or declaration of cause, there were 2. Most people don't know that the second one even exists. But in both of them, they talked about this. In the first ordinance or declaration of causes, South Carolina spent roughly 50% of the document going line by line, explaining the purpose and intent of the Constitution and the relationship of the states to the general government. And when they get to the part about slavery, the statement in there is, or the message in there is, that with regards to slavery, the general government is violating the Constitution as agreed upon. And if they can do it on this issue, they can do it on any other. When you go focus in on slavery, all you're doing is cherry picking. You're not reading the documents in context, in proper context. And history without context is nonsense. It doesn't make any sense. That's why these boobs can get on here and say stupid stuff, and the average person laps it up because they don't understand the context of the times. And that this entire video is, there's almost no truthful statements. It falls somewhere between ignorance, obfuscation, and outright lies through the entire 5-minute video. I assume that his name is, in fact, Ty Sedgley. Other than that, everything else he said is nonsense.
Well, there was an Abraham Lincoln.
Well, unfortunately, yes. He goes on, states' rights meant the right to spread and maintain slavery. That's a bunch of garbage. That is nonsense. Look, 3 times during the war, or leading up to the war. Spring of 1861, in Lincoln's inaugural address, he told the states, I have no purpose, either directly or indirectly, to interfere in the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. He goes on to say there will be invasion and violence only if necessary to collect the tariff. He goes on further in the same address and says that I would even endorse this Corwin Amendment. He didn't call it that, but he said an amendment that is passed through Congress. And the Corwin Amendment, which is what he was referring to, would have enshrined slavery in the Constitution forever, because he said I would have made it express and irrevocable. All right, so number one, rejoin the Union, and slavery is not a problem. We're gonna guarantee slavery to you through this amendment. Flash forward to the Emancipation Proclamation. He announced it in the spring of 1862. Now, Sedgley says in there that this was law. It was not law. It was akin to a modern day executive order, which is not to be found in the Constitution. The President of the United States nor the Congress, either one, had the delegated authority to end slavery. How was slavery ended? Through an amendment, because only the states, through the amendment process, could end slavery. So the idea that Lincoln passed this law, well, he's again showing either his ignorance of how the Constitution works, or he's willfully lying, willfully misleading you. But as you said, Lincoln introduced that proclamation in September of 1862. He said of it that he knew it had no basis in law, that it was a war measure, but he gave the South 100 days to rejoin the Union, and the proclamation would no longer apply to them. They would be able to retain their slaves. That's the second time he told them this. Rejoin the Union, you can have slaves. Third time was the Hampton Roads Conference in Virginia in the early part of 1865, just a few months before the war ended. He met with emissaries of the Confederacy, and
including Alexander Stephens.
One of them was Stephens, that's correct. Who, by the way, he and Lincoln were good friends because they were both former Whigs. And Stephens was he was a Whig. He was a big government guy. Okay, but that's a different topic for a different time. But they met there. Lincoln assured the South that Union, the 13th Amendment, would never pass because you'd have the votes to defeat it. There's no way with the South back in the Union that we're going to get 3/4 ratification, and you can keep slavery for time immemorial. And the South said, no, we can't. We're not going to rejoin the Union. The only thing that we can end this war on is the agreement that we get our full independence. So 3 times between 1861, 1862, 1865, Lincoln offered the South peace in return for, or slavery, I should say, in return for their rejoining the Union. 3 times they denied it. This idea that Lincoln's views on the institution evolved, that's bunk. He was willing to sell the slaves out for money, for the ability to retain Southern taxation. He would have put slavery in the Constitution forever. All right, so that's the first lesson there. The second one is, if the South only cared about slavery, why did they turn down all 3 of Lincoln's offers? Mr. Sedgley is an extremely confused man, and he's also either he's just grossly ignorant or he's a liar. I report, you decide. Here's another example of mass obfuscation. He says through somewhere in about the middle of the video that some argue that the sections lived in such economically different societies that they could no longer stay together. Again, he says, not true, that authoritarian voice of his. And that in the middle of the 19th century, both societies were agrarian, and that, in fact, the North produced far more food crops than did the South. But Northerners had to pay their farmhands while the South exploited slaves over whom they had total control. All right, there's a lot wrong in this statement. There's a lot of stuff that is intentionally left out. Some would not argue that the sections lived in economically different societies. They lived in economically different societies. All right. The industrial age in the middle of the 19th century had not kicked in yet, but it was coming. But going back to the original date of 1787, and even before that, the two sections were economically different in that the North was mercantilist. They weren't industrial yet because industrialization had not started, but they were mercantilist where the South was agrarian. The fact that they raised more food crops is only telling you part of the picture. I got news for him. Food is not the only crop. Okay. They had to raise more food crops than the South did because they had more people. They had about 4 or 5 times the population. So, of course, they were raising more food. But the South, their economy was not centered around food. Their society was not centered around food and growing these crops. That was substance farming. Their economy was centered around mercantilism, which is basically shop owners, things of that nature, whereas the South's economy was centered around trade and around cash crops, such as sugarcane, indigo, cotton, of course, and various other things like that was being exported around the world. He says Northerners had to pay their farmhands while the South exploited slaves over whom they had total control. Well, of course, the North had to pay their farmhands. They did not allow black people into their states. They had realized that slavery was not financially stable in the North. It was not profitable in the North because the climate was not conducive to an agrarian-based society. He's trying to take the word, he's trying to look at the economic, trying to paint them as the same economically, but what he's also doing is he is avoiding the cultural distinctions, and those are more important. Yankeeism comes out of, as I've explained on here more times than y'all probably want to hear, but it comes out of New England Puritanism, and it is a very collectivist-based mentality. Centered around the idea of liberty, for example, is a collective. It's not an individual thing in Yankee society to this day, but even back then, even 400 years ago, before they even got here. All right. In the South, liberty is an individual right. So there were cultural differences in addition to economic differences, and that was the real issue. So here's the problem. With what he's trying to say. The Union was formed on the basis that they knew of these cultural distinctions between the deep North, the Middle Atlantic, and the Southern states. Everybody recognized at that time the cultural differences. George Mason said it in the Virginia Ratifying Convention that one central government would never be sufficient to the governance of people so different in their manners, habits, and customs. They knew this. That is why they created a federal government with power delegated by the states to the general government. And outside of those 18 delegated powers, each state had the right to govern its own affairs according to its own constitution, which was formed in accordance with its own culture. That was the only way the Union could work. And I'll stop there because I've been going on. I got more, but I'll let you cut in and.
No. Keep going.
All right. So culture is central to the entire issue here. The South knew that by Lincoln and the radical Republicans trying to force this one-size-fits-all government on the issue or on the entire country, that it was going to, number one, it was going to neutralize or negate or lessen at least their representation in their own government. That's why the North did not want slavery spreading to the West. They wanted to gain those states for, as Lincoln said, free white labor in an effort to choke off the South and keep them confined to this one area. He didn't care if they kept slavery there. He didn't want it spreading west because he was trying to create states that would be loyal to and supportive of his party, the Republican Party. But it was always a cultural thing. The South knew that they could not be governed in a government that was dominated by Yankee culture. Guess what? The number one problem in America today is that we are governed by that one thing. That's why, you know, you see people like us, we have no voice in our own government. You know, the government at any level comes in and does whatever it wants to do. We have no representation there. You know why? Because we're not Yankees. We're not leftists. It caters to this leftist mentality on large scale. All right. If we were following the Constitution, that would be impossible because Alabama would be governed by a government that reflected Alabamian culture. The same in Mississippi, same in Texas, same in Idaho, and various, you know, anywhere else. That's how the Union was formed. So Sedgley is missing all of that. He's missing the one-size-fits-all government trying to ram that down the throat of the South, using slavery as an excuse for the war. Slavery was nothing more than a euphemism for power when Northern politicians talked about the institution. I don't know the details on this. I'd have to look into it more, but Brian McClanahan, I've heard him say on a few occasions now that Lincoln's plan for slavery would have actually allowed it to last up into the early years of the 20th century. So this idea that he was some, you know, altruistic humanitarian, it's bunk. There is no proof for that. Many people argue that Lincoln fought the war to hold the Union together, not to end slavery, and says, this was true at the beginning of the war, but he did so with the clear knowledge that keeping the Union together meant either spreading slavery to all the states, an unacceptable solution, or vanquishing it altogether. And then he cites Lincoln's 1858 House Divided speech and says Lincoln's view never changed. And as the war progressed, the moral component ending slavery became more and more fixed in his mind. He further states his Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 turned that into law. That's all totally, completely bogus. We already covered that, but, you know, like I said, Lincoln was willing to sell the slaves out all the way up into the early months of 1865. So we're talking just a couple of months, a few weeks before the war ended. He was still telling the South, rejoin the Union, you can keep your slaves. Sedgley has not, honestly, his entire video looks like it was read from a script written on Wikipedia. There is no historic value to it. There is no research that went into it. And furthermore, I don't know of a single war ever in the history of mankind other than this that was supposedly caused by one issue. Every other war that I'm aware of has had religious underpinnings to it. It's had cultural underpinnings to it. It's had economic underpinnings, but not this war. This is the only one in the history of the human race that was caused by one thing: the evil South wanting to keep their slaves. Well, that's stupid.
Yeah, and you know, one thing that really, you know, just irks me about those superior, well, I'm not going to say what I really want to call them, but, you know, he alludes in there, lets the average viewer who doesn't know any better believe that, you know, once the war between the states ended, and, you know, then all of a sudden slavery on the entire world scale was suddenly abolished. And then act like it, that he also, you know, kind of implies in there that it was strictly an American issue.
Oh, sure.
You know, Russia didn't free the serfs, which was their version of slavery, until 1862. The British and the French empires, they freed theirs in the earlier part of the United States history, the early 1800s. But more than that, you know, when he goes and talks about secession and the causation of secession and stuff like that, and applying that the secession was the causation of the war, he doesn't have the intellectual honesty to mention Massachusetts and New England's secession attempts during the War of 1812.
Right. Well, not only then, they tried. I can come up with 5 or 6. The earliest mention of secession was actually 1794, and that was when Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut and Rufus King of Massachusetts cornered John Taylor of Caroline, Virginia, in a room close to the, right off the Senate chamber, and told him, look, all these great ideas that we've got to enlarge the power of government are not working. The South keeps blocking everything. Maybe we should just go ahead and secede because this is not going to work. Well, that was the point of the Constitution. It wasn't supposed to allow other states to inflict their ideas on all the other states. But Taylor was taken aback by this. He was, he was kind of surprised at it. The second one was they discussed secession at the election of Thomas Jefferson. The fact that they was lost, they were going to mull the idea of secession again during the Louisiana Purchase. And I have seen, I've read, I don't remember where, that the Battle of New Orleans is what changed their mind on seceding in 1814, because when Andrew Jackson won that battle, they knew that all of a sudden the United States have a chance of winning this war. And they thought, well, we better go back and stay in the Union, or we won't have access to all the lands that that the French were going to conquer. So, or the British, were going to conquer. So that was another one. Then you had, the annexation of Texas and the Mexican War. And this was, you're talking 13, 14 years before Lincoln is elected. And the interesting thing about some of these issues, like Oliver Ellsworth and Rufus King, for example, when they were talking about secession, well, guess what? They were both at the Philadelphia Convention. They were both involved in the writing and ratification of the Constitution. Now, don't you think, being that they were there, that they probably knew whether it was legal or not? Okay. Right. You get up into the era of Jefferson's victory over Adams and the Louisiana Purchase. Guess what? Most of the people that were involved in the writing and ratification of the Constitution were still alive. Everybody knew secession was legal. Everybody knew it.
Right. It was still that generation.
Yeah. Nobody started denying it. And here's an interesting thing: we down Daniel Webster a lot, because Webster argued against the federal nature of the Constitution in a lot of his famous debates with John C. Calhoun. But to Webster's credit, before the end of his life, he came back and admitted Calhoun had been wrong all along. And a lot of the stuff had been right all along. That's correct. And a lot of the stuff that Lincoln believed came out of Webster's arguments before he saw the light, and some of that had been handed down. I tell you right now, Lincoln did not know the Constitution very well. Apparently, attorneys in that time did not understand it any better than attorneys do today, because they even, I think, even by then, they had begun determining constitutionality on court precedent rather than on original intent.
Right. One last thing before we take a small commercial break that really just infuriates me about this entire video is he lays the entire institution of slavery at the South's feet.
Sure.
He doesn't have the intellectual honesty to go in and say, Massachusetts, Philadelphia, all the original 13 colonies, had the institution of slavery. When it was realized that slavery did not work in the North, they didn't, free them and send them back to Africa or whatever. They sold them down south.
That's right.
It was the immoral triangle, I believe is what it's called. The fact that slaves were picked up from Africa, sailed up north, sold down south, and then the same boats were loaded with goods from the south, back to just the transatlantic triangle. The North had just as much to do with the institution on this on the American soil, on the American continent, than the South did, and the full blame should not be solely at the South's feet. But Moose, come on, Moosey.
Hello there.
All right. Take us to a quick commercial. We'll be right back. I've got to run and visit the room next door really quickly.
All right. Well, we want to thank the Kennedy twins for sponsoring tonight's Pop-Tart break with their newest book, Jefferson Davis, High Road to Emancipation and Constitutional Government. Jefferson Davis, High Road to Emancipation and Constitutional Government is about how Jefferson Davis was a leader in the high road to emancipation. He looked for a day which slaves would be prepared to live and participate in society. He did more, though, than advocate for this high road to emancipation. He practiced his beliefs in the ultimate emancipation of Southern slaves. Many of his former slaves left for prosperity and their testimony about their former master, who prepared them to be self-sustaining members of society. You can get the Kennedy twins' newest book, Jefferson Davis, High Road to Emancipation and Constitutional Government, at www.kennedykitwins.com and most online bookstores, including www.scv.org and www.visitbeauvoir.org. We want to thank the Kennedy twins for sponsoring tonight's Pop-Tart break, and we will be right back after this Pop-Tart break.
There is a place nestled in the rolling farmland of southern Middle Tennessee. A home constructed in 1837, nearly lost to the ravages of war. Saved by a servant and a Confederate general. A place where families loved and lost. If walls could talk, what stories could be told? If a place, a home, can feel love, loss, pain, surely this is one of those places. Nearby is a more recent structure, and inside are the stories of heroes and heroines, stories of battles won and lost, stories of sacrifices made by the people of its native soil. A place that will tell the true and complete story of the Southland and the war fought for its freedom. From the causes that led to the conflict to the modern-day struggles to protect Southern history. Historic Elm Springs and the Confederate Museum at Elm Springs are the general headquarters for the Sons of Confederate Veterans. A place where the story of the Southland and its historic struggle is preserved and told. Come and discover your history.
Gives me goosebumps every time. We want to thank the Kennedy twins again for sponsoring tonight's Pop-Tart break with their newest book, Jefferson Davis, High Road to Emancipation. And available at www.kennedytwins.com and most online bookstores, including www.scv.org and www.visitbeauvoir.org.
Freeze up on the car.
Nope.
Okay.
I'm waiting on you to tell me to go.
Are you on your mark? Get set. Get him.
There's a great book out by Thomas Sowell. I'm sure most of our listeners know who he is. If you don't, you should. He's a black man. He's an economist. At one time, he was actually a Marxist until he began studying economics and I think became a close friend of Milton Friedman. And he switched over to being a very conservative individual in the true sense of the word, not what we call conservatism today, but he was an actual conservative. And a brilliant guy, like Walter Williams and Milton Friedman, the three of them, one of the things about the three of them that made them so brilliant to me was that they could take very complex subjects and make it where average people like you and me could understand them. We didn't have to have a PhD to know what they were talking about. But Dr. Soul actually has a book out called Black Rednecks and White Liberals. And in there, he talks about slavery. And if you just want to hear that section of it, you can actually go to YouTube and look it up. There are several reaction channels to it where you've got somebody listening to it and reacting it. All of them are shocked to know some of the things that he's saying. The implication that Sedgley sort of pushes here is that the evil South is the only place on the planet, like you kind of said earlier. That's like everybody thinks, they've been led to believe that's the origin of slavery, that it's unique to the South and Southern culture. Well, that's completely untrue. In fact, slavery had been around for thousands of years, and it had absolutely nothing to do with race. Nothing. You have Eastern Europeans enslaving other Eastern Europeans. You have Africans and Egyptians and enslaving others of their own people. Portuguese enslaving other Portuguese. Why? Because rather than being a racial issue, it was an issue of the strong preying upon the weak. Simple as that. The African slave trade, prior to when it started, 2,000 years earlier, you could not have brought slaves to European countries or to North America, even though we weren't here yet. You couldn't have brought them here if you wanted to. The technology did not exist to be able to go to Africa and pick them up and then transport them across the Atlantic into North America. But yet slavery was still going on. When you get up into the era in the early mid 1600s, when slaves were first being brought to North America, you didn't have white slavers going into the interior of sub-Saharan Africa and capturing these slaves. They could not do that because their immunities would not allow them to. Their life expectancy would decline. The average life expectancy of a European man who went into sub-Saharan Africa would be about 1 year, because he would catch some illness and die. And actually the death toll on the slave ships was as high among the crew as it was among the slaves themselves. These are not my words. I'm giving you an overview of what Dr. Soul uncovered in his research. So this idea that slavery originated with evil Southern white people is bunk.
Right. I mean, every tribe and society, all the way back to the biblical times, had slavery. The Romans, they whenever they would conquer somebody, they had slavery. When Columbus arrived here on this continent, or Leif Erikson, whichever came first, there were Native Americans who had enslaved other tribes of Native Americans. It's what happened. You defeated a people, you subjugated. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? You subjugated a people to your will.
Sure. And as much as Sedgley would like to say that there was no economic factor to the war, that it was all about slavery, which again is just, that is so elementary. It's such a sophomoric view that it's just borderline moronic to even imply such a thing. But as much as he wants to say there was no economic component to it, if any of you want to read a good book on the economics by a guy named Jeffrey Rogers Hummel, who I believe, if memory serves, was actually a student of Walter Williams at one point. And for those that don't know, Walter Williams is the one who wrote the foreword to Thomas D. Lorenzo's book, The Real Lincoln. But Jeffrey Rogers Hummel wrote a book called Emancipating Slaves, Enslaving Free Men. He doesn't pull any punches. He's hard on the North and South alike. He's hard on the issue of slavery, but he's hard, but he's fair, I think. He's objective. And Nothing could be truer than the way what his final conclusion on the outcome of Lincoln's War is, where he states in there, Lincoln's victory did not end slavery. Rather, what it did was to transfer the ownership of slaves from the plantation to the government and then expand the plantation to include us all.
Mm-hmm.
I was going to let you come in there.
Well, I know, but I mean, it's hard to. I mean, you're absolutely right. That's what I was getting at with the whole, you defeat somebody and then subjugate them. Kind of thing. And you elaborate, or you actually said what I was meaning to say with that last bit. One little thing that I threw up a second ago is it's estimated that in 2021, 49.6 million people were still living in modern day slavery.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
But yet Lincoln, the great emancipator, which we're not praising the institution by any means whatsoever.
Oh, absolutely not.
Yeah, we're just debunking the fact that this 2.9 million people have watched this video in the past 8 years since it came out, and believe this malarkey. If they don't go and do their own independent research or watch a video like this. I digress. It's still an issue that has plagued us since the beginning of time, and it's still an issue that plagues us now. So, yeah.
Yeah, and Ron Kennedy mentions in the comments the book Time on the Cross. I've got to read that book. Brian talked about it in a great episode of his podcast, Brian McClanahan. You can look him up, it's BRION, McClanahan on YouTube. I try to watch every podcast he does, but he mentioned that book and Roll Jordan Roll by Eugene Genovese. And both of these books were written by people from the left. Genovese was at one time a Marxist. And actually, the more he studied the Southern tradition, he wound up becoming a Jeffersonian before all was said and done. But Time on the Cross and Roll Jordan Roll, I have read most of Roll Jordan Roll. And Time on the Cross, Brian says, is also an excellent book. And what they do is they just go in there and they report the facts. And they caught a lot of flack for these books. There was one instance Brian mentioned where the Time on the Cross authors, I can't remember their names, but they were on the Merv Griffin show. And he was trying, well, how can you say this and how can you say that? They said, well, very simple, because that's what the data shows. That's what our research uncovered. We're not out here trying to prove some preconceived idea that we had. When we got into the data and into the facts, this is what we concluded. And, you like it or not, but this is the way it was. So, yeah, if you want to know more about slavery, and, and as an organization, I said for years, I don't think we need to run from the issue. We need to tell it, but we need to tell it honestly, which the other side of, does not do. Our adversaries do not do that. They're using it as a polemic to smear our ancestors and smear our entire culture, to smear the entire South up to this day. I mean, they're using this as a weapon. The South is still looked on today because of an institution that has been dead for over 150 years, and they're still using it against us.
Yeah, and just like we talked about last week with the charge, we're to vindicate the cause for which our Confederate ancestors fought. PragerU, when they released this video and let Ichabod Crane get up there and talk, they're the aggressors this time. They're the ones who have fired the first shot. Only thing we're doing is our duty. And like we talked about last week, we're to defend the Confederate soldiers' good name, which is another reason why we're doing this. And finally, the only way, the way that we win this war this time is for our membership to not only be educated, but to educate the rest of the South of what really happened, what really motivated the Confederate soldier, and things of that nature. So that's why we're doing this episode. That's where we're going to do more episodes. There, I saw it in the comments a minute ago. Somebody mentioning a couple other channels. Don't worry, we're going to be hitting those channels as well. That's just what we got to do with it.
Well, and here's the big issue, and Brian has mentioned this a number of times on his podcasts, and I 100% agree. Actually, I'd had this thought too before I even heard Brian say it. Because it's kind of obvious, really. But you have these so-called conservative entities out there like PragerU and Hillsdale and other pseudo historians like David Barton and some of these guys, and they're out there smearing the South and holding Lincoln up as some icon of conservatism. Lincoln was a leftist. He was not a social leftist. He was not a liberal in the way that we think of the term today, meaning he did not go along with liberal social programs. But when it came to economics and his view of government, he was very much a leftist. He believed in a strong central government and a strong regulatory apparatus and corporate government or private public partnerships, which in the 20th century Benito Mussolini would call fascism. All this stuff, protectionism for favored entities. So that was what Lincoln favored. When you go out there and you try to elevate him to this status as conservative hero, and then simultaneously you're bashing the Jeffersonian South, what you're really doing is you're undermining true conservatism. You're shooting down your own arguments. It's almost like a version of Stockholm syndrome, on the part of some of these so-called conservative entities. What conservatism is morphed into is a Hamiltonian, Lincolnian, ultra-nationalist, centralized government apparatus. In other words, there's nothing conservative about it except on a handful of social issues. It's worthless in the modern day.
Any final thoughts, Carl?
That's it. I'm sure I could say more, but I won't. We'll save it for another time.
Moose, you got anything?
Nothing.
Okay, Moose.
I was going to say I definitely wanted Carl to take tonight, you and GCB. I enjoy these episodes where I myself can sit back and learn, and I'm extremely happy that we're going to start doing these video series. It's something that's been on our mind probably since even season 1. We've been wanting to do this, and so we're looking forward to it. I'm ready to dive in at some point, but I guess the only thing left to say is to remember to tune in to look around the Confederation. This week we will have the Army of Northern Virginia commander and councilman on. They will be talking on, of course, the Army of Northern Virginia. So make sure to tune into that. Make sure to share this episode out. We need this episode to be shared a lot. We need to educate people. A lot of our own crowd already knows this. And while it's good to educate ourselves, how about we educate everybody else at the same time? So share this out.
Right. And last week, guys, I'll put it like this. I checked the video statistics from last week, and our little video on the charge reached over 2,000 people. That's just on something that we all hold dear and what we know about our own organization. Imagine now there have been, and like I said, in the past 8 years that this video has been up, 2.9 million people have seen that video from PragerU. 2.9 million. We've got a lot of ground to catch up on if we're wanting to right the wrongs from this video. So share. Make sure you share this with the members of your camps, with your brigades, with your divisions, your other subsidiaries. Share it out, share it alike, make sure that. Also, Moose talked about Look Around the Confederation on Thursday, but don't forget about our other shows like Look Around Southwest Florida with Sean McFall. I believe that's tomorrow night. And and the Douglas Southall Freeman chat that's on Friday night, Michael C. Hardy's chat, everything like that. So make sure you're watching those. The way we win this battle is by being educated. So let's get educated.
Amen.
All right, guys. Well, we appreciate everything. We appreciate y'all watching. Until next time on Thursday, remember, in the words of the late, great Harold Philpotts, no Fumar in the elevator.
No Fumar in the elevator.
Ref Rob.
Ref Rob.
Right or Frop.